Hi, in this video we're going to be working with how to work with adding and subtracting integers. Before we do that, we first have to ask ourselves, what is an integer? And why is it even used in math? Well, an integer is going to represent any whole number that has a negative, positive, or even zero value. But why is it used in math? How is it even used in real life? Well, imagine I was shooting a basketball from the ground, for example, and I wanted to make it into the basket, so I had to shoot it 10 feet above the ground. That value of me going upwards, the basketball going upwards, would represent a positive 10 value. Well, what if we were on top of a building that was 100 feet in the air from the ground, and I wanted to throw a penny all the way to the ground? Because that penny is going in a negative direction, that means that that penny flew negative 100 feet to the ground. So integers help represent positive, negative values in real life situations, but it even includes zero. The one thing you have to remember about integers, you cannot have any decimals or fractions. So think of a number line, something that you've worked with in the past. Your normal number line consists of all integers, negative, positive, as including zero. Make sense? Okay. So the next question is going to be, what are our rules? The better you know these rules, the better you are going to be in all algebra topics when it comes to combining integers. So there's three rules you have to always remember. When there's one negative is always going to represent subtraction. When there's two negatives, that's always going to represent addition. When there's two negatives next to each other, keyword next to each other, you're going to always turn that into a positive. Okay? So what do we do after we subtract, we add, or turn into a positive? Remember, one negative you subtract, two negatives you add, and two negatives next to each other, you turn into a positive. Once you do all of that, you're going to be left with an answer. Now, what's the sign of that answer? The sign is dependent on just what is the bigger number in that problem. So if your bigger number was positive, your answer is going to be positive. If your bigger number was negative, then your answer is going to be negative depending on the situation. Okay? So once again, what's the rule for one negative? You subtract, then keep the sign of the bigger number. What happens when you have two negatives in the problem that are not next to each other? You're going to add. What's the sign? The sign of the bigger number. And then last rule, what happens when you have two negatives next to each other? You turn into a positive and then go back to the beginning, which is going to be how many negatives you have left, which is one negative or two negatives, and you follow the rules. Make sense? Copy these rules down, know them, because it's going to help assist you on getting this answer correct. So let's try a couple. So on the next slide, I'm going to help you guys do this one. I want to make sure we do well on this. So the first example, what happens when there's one negative in the problem? You look at all of these A through D and you see one negative except D, but I'll show you why. So for the first one, negative 2 plus 4. What are you going to do? Just ask yourself, how many negatives do you have in the problem? You have one negative. So what do you do when you have one negative? You're going to subtract. You're not going to subtract 2 minus 4. That's not true. What I always want you to do when you subtract the bigger minus the smaller. What's 4 minus 2? 4 minus 2 is 2. And then your next step is going to be, what is the bigger number? Is your bigger number positive or negative? Because 4 is the bigger number, 4 is positive. How do I know? The sign next to it represents a positive value. So my answer is just going to be a positive 2, so I'm just going to leave it just like that, and that's it for A. What about B? B is 3 minus 8. So what are we going to do? How many negatives do you have? You have one negative. So what are you going to do? Bigger minus smaller. What's 8 minus 3? 8 minus 3 is 5. And then you're going to keep the sign of the bigger number. What's the bigger number? The bigger number is 8. So then your answer is going to be negative 5. And that's going to be B. What about C? C is something that you guys are used to. What's 5 minus 4? I know you know that already. 5 minus 4 is 1. Now that was simple. Why do we know this? Because there was one negative in the problem, so you subtract 5 minus 4. And then because the bigger number was 5, that's the reason why it was positive. Now D. What happens when you see two negatives next to each other? You turn into a positive. So this right here is going to turn to a positive, so I'm going to rewrite it. It's going to be negative 6 plus 2. And then when you see this, you're going to go back to the beginning. How many negatives do you have? You have one negative. So what do? You subtract. So you're going to subtract 6 minus 2. 6 minus 2 is 4. And then you're going to keep the sign of the bigger number, which is what? 6. So your answer is going to be -4. And that's it. That's your final answer. So when there's one negative in a problem, you're going to subtract and then keep the sign of the bigger number. Next one. We're still going to do these together. If you want to try one on your own, go for it. But you're going to notice there's 2 negatives in the problem. So let's go ahead and do it. First one, how many negatives do you see? You see a -2 and a -4. So that's 2 negatives. So what do I do when there's 2 negatives? Go back to the rules. You have to add. 2 negatives always represent addition. So I'm going to add them like normal. 2 plus 4 is 6. Look at the sign of the bigger number. Bigger number is 4, but do you realize they're both negative? So because they're both negative, my final answer is going to also be negative. And that's my answer for A. Let's look at B. -3 minus 8. How many negatives do you have? You have 2 negatives, so just add them. 3 plus 8 is 11. Sign of the bigger one is negative, but they're both negative, so you can just say it's -11. C. -5 plus -4. They're trying to throw you off with the plus and the negative. Doesn't matter. Count how many negatives you have. You have 2. So what do you do when there's 2 negatives? You add. 5 plus 4 is 9. Since they're both negative, it's going to say negative. Last one, -6 plus -2. Don't fall for it. 2 negatives you add. 6 plus 2 is 8. Keep the sign of the bigger one, which is 6. So it's -8. And that's your final answer. Okay? So remember, 1 negative you subtract, 2 negatives you add, and then keep the sign of the bigger number. Now on the next slide, this is going to be for you to practice. So if you guys want to pause the screen, just try them really quickly and then play, go for it. If not, let's go ahead and do them together. -3 plus 4. 1 negative. 1 negative you subtract. 4 minus 3 is 1. Bigger number is 4. So my answer is going to be +1. B. There's 2 negatives. So because there's 2 negatives, I'm going to add. 6 plus 8 is 14. They're both negative, so my answer is going to be negative. So my answer is -14. C. 2 plus -10. How many negatives do you have? You have 1. So what am I going to do? Subtract. Bigger minus smaller. 10 minus 2 is 8. Bigger number is 10, so it's going to be -8. D. -6 plus -2. 2 negatives. So what do? Add. 6 plus 2 is 8. Since they're both negative, it's going to remain -8. Last one, 5 minus -2. What happens when there's 2 negatives next to each other? It turns into a plus sign. So I'm going to rewrite it. 5 plus 2. And you obviously know what that represents. 5 plus 2 is 7. And that's my final answer. So if you got this right, amazing. Great job. It's just 2 simple rules that help you out in working with combining integers. So in our last slide, it's going to be, again, a mixed review. If you want to pause it, go for it. And then press play, and I'll be answering the questions. So A, -5 minus 4. How many negatives do you see? You see 2. So what am I going to do? I'm going to add. 5 plus 4 is 9. Because they're both negative, it represents -9. 7 minus 8. How many negatives do you see? You see 1. When you see 1 negative, what do? You subtract. Bigger minus smaller. 8 minus 7 is 1. What's the bigger answer? The bigger number is 8, and 8 is negative, so it's going to represent a -1. C, -12 minus 10. Because they're both negative, what are you going to do? You're going to add. 12 plus 10 is 22. Because they're both negative, it stays negative. So my final answer is -22. D, -16 plus -2. They're both negative, so what am I going to do? I'm going to add. 16 plus 2 is 18, but because they're both negative, it's going to represent -18. Last one, -8 minus -3. There's a lot of negatives there, so what do? We first go in the rules. If you see double negative, turn that to a positive. I'm going to turn it into a positive, and the next question is going to read -8 plus 3. And what's -8 plus 3? Do the rules again. 1 negative, you subtract. 8 minus 3 is 5. So my answer is 5, but is it positive or negative? Depends on the bigger number. The bigger number is 8, so it's going to be -5, and that's my final answer for E. Okay? Hopefully you got them all right. Hopefully this helped you out. So what are the rules that we have to always remember? The rules are this. When you see 1 negative, you're going to subtract. When you subtract, your sign is going to be the sign of the bigger number, depending on if it's positive or negative. Rule number 2, if you see 2 negatives, you're going to add. And because they're both negative, it's going to stay negative. Or if you want to remember the sign of the bigger number, that's fine. That's going to work for every problem. Last one. When you see two negatives next to each other, you're going to turn that to an addition symbol and then go back to the beginning to ask yourself, is there one or two negatives in the problem? Okay? Hopefully this helped. Thank you for watching and best of luck.